Hello, everyone. How are we doing? I'm Eddie, aka Dancing Eddie. I'm gonna make this real quick because I want to hear from these guys because I'm an L1 or L1 rising L2 in the legal industry, and this panel is building the legal framework for the blockchain. We have starting us off. We have Rick Tapia, CEO and founder of DraftChain. He'll be our moderator for today. We also have Caitlin Long, and hold on, you are the CEO. Correct me if I'm wrong. Of Custodia Bank. Excellent. After that, we got Jeremy Evans, founder of California Sports Lawyer. And finally, Erin Friez, COO and CCO at Digital Ascension Group. I hope you guys enjoy. Vamos.
Thank you so much for that great introduction, and thank you to my panelists for joining us today. And we'll try not to bore you guys too much. I know we're getting pretty close to happy hour, so we'll try not to bore you too much with all of our legal mumbles. So to kind of start some things off as just kind of an introduction. So yeah, I'm Rick Tapia. I'm the CEO and founder at DraftChain AI. We are a legal tech AI business that is focused on revolutionizing the practice of law, utilizing AI and emerging technologies. I also am the general counsel for Digital Ascension Group, which is one of two family office syndicates in the U.S. focused on digital assets. So I'll let everybody else kind of do a quick introduction of themselves, and then we can jump into some questions.
Caitlin Long got slotted into this panel at the last minute. Not exactly dressed for being on stage, but thank you all for pulling me into since I was here. CEO of Custodia Bank, involved in a little fight over the debanking of this industry.
Erin Friez, I'm the COO and CCO of Digital Ascension Group. We're a multifamily office, an RIA focused on wealth management in the crypto space.
Hello, everybody. Jeremy Evans from Newport Beach, California. Currently founder of California Sports Lawyer, where I deal with entertainment, media, and sports law. And then immediate past president of the California Lawyers Association, which is the largest bar association in the country.
Awesome, awesome. Well, to kind of start things off, and this is just kind of a general question for everybody, when we think about kind of the regulatory landscape in the U.S. when it comes to digital assets, there's no shortage of things for us to discuss. But, as we're obviously nearing, a critical election period as well, what does the current regulatory landscape for digital assets look in the U.S., and where do you think it should be heading? And Caitlin, I'll start with you, and we'll go down the line.
Well, obviously, under the Biden administration, it's ugly. And they really, truly, the Warren crowd, there's a faction in the Democratic Party, the Warren faction, and then there's the more moderate faction. And the Warren crowd just wants us all dead, wants us offshore, would be happy if we didn't exist, and is trying to drive us all out. But I am especially grateful for the moderates who are really trying to solve that problem. And some have reached out directly to me, and I am working with them. I am not part of the group that is shunning them at all, because frankly, if they're able to get a breakthrough with the Harris campaign and the Harris administration, if she's elected, we're all better off for it. If Trump is elected, the expectation is that it would be a better environment for us. But who knows? It is fair to say that Trump was a skeptic, isn't now, but it all depends. And personnel is policy, and it all depends on who ultimately. It all depends on who ultimately gets elected, because personnel is policy.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. I mean, the current state of regulation is muddy and messy and ever-changing, and can sometimes feel like quicksand. Sitting in a compliance role, it's really challenging to know how to navigate this space, and it changes frequently. And even when you think you're doing the right things, sometimes you are not. The current state that we have is, all of the enforcement actions and regulation by enforcement, that it's changing frequently. It feels like a scattershot approach when you think about all of the different suits that are being brought by the SEC and the parties that they're targeting in different districts, with different outcomes in different districts, depending on the judge that you get, that will likely go up through the appeals process. I think the good news is that it does seem to be some shifting sands on both sides of the aisle, which is what we need. I heard somebody recently say that crypto is becoming a purple issue, which I think is a good way to describe it. There needs to be, I think there's a clarity of the need for, fit for purpose regulation. We see a lot of these bills that are moving through the House, and now we've got some commitments from the Senate just today, I think, or this week, talking about how they're committed to getting some sensible regulations, through the Senate as well this year. So I think that we've got some good news on both sides to get some clarity. We're certainly not in that environment yet. Like Caitlin said, the outcome of the election is going to matter in either way, and hopefully it's good news either way. But it certainly will shift. So it's ever changing at the moment.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think the digital asset issue is similar to some of the other issues that we deal with. For example, if you look at the way sort of marijuana is dealt with, or alcohol is dealt with, or sports gambling is dealt with, right? It's like every state has a different way of doing things. So I think from a federal level, as you guys were talking about, there should be a standard across the board because you're dealing with currency. Or maybe not. Maybe each state has its own law. But ultimately, I think that from a practical standpoint, you got to get that good legal counsel. And ultimately, what it means is that I think a lot of times in the digital space, people think that, oh, we don't need contracts. There's we can sort of ignore this stuff at the bottom. But
Code is law, right?
Right. Yeah. It's like it doesn't change because it's in it. It's out here. You got to get the contracts. You need to still do the same things you're doing in the sort of physical space.
Yeah, and really good points, and thank you so much. So, kind of to Jeremy, to your last point, when we think about, obviously that, some people kind of are on this kind of code is law fence. Other people are like, hey, you need to really do things from a completely regulatory and legally compliant way, especially when we think of like things like DAOs and some of the regulatory uncertainties with that. And this is, again, kind of a general question for everybody. What shape or like what are some of these regulations should look like as we go forward? I mean, how do you strike this balance of not stifling innovation, but also obviously promoting consumer protection? And Jeremy, we'll circle back around and start with you this time.
This is interesting because I'll go back to, I'll use AI as an example. President Biden had passed or signed an executive order that dealt with AI and sort of had this baseline policy saying, if AI affects human beings in a negative way, it has to go through some like FDA approval type process, right? I thought that was a pretty standard law. I think that sort of makes sense, or executive order. But to me, I think when you're dealing with blockchain in any sort of digital asset, again, it comes down to the basics, right? You got to have laws in place. That's where the legislature comes in. But unfortunately, the legislature works a lot like firemen in firehouses in that you respond to a fire. Very rarely does legislature get ahead of things. So this is why we're talking about this at conferences, right? So I think you need to get legislation in play. This is where lobbyists come into play. I also think that we need to figure out, as I mentioned earlier, whether this is going to be a federal framework or a state-to-state framework. And I think that's the interesting question, and whether Congress can come together to have some sort of federal law that addresses these issues. Right.
Yeah, I think when it comes to what's needed, I mean, I think clarity is key, honestly, regardless of what's included in a final bill. I've spent 8 years in this space, and I've stayed on the institutional side. I've helped many traditional financial institutions enter this space and try to make sense of it. And clarity is really what they're seeking. I mean, obviously, I have some opinions on, which regulator is probably best suited and how these assets should be viewed. I think disclosures are obviously going to be a key part of any crypto legislation and need to be clear. Having disclosures around the tokenomics and in the code and the team and making sure that all of that is well known by the retail space. But to me, clarity is prominent above everything, and making sure that in whatever crypto legislation is passed, it is clear which regulator has authority and which situations. I know, like, for instance, Fit 21 has different regulatory bodies having jurisdiction in different situations, and sometimes one token can have a different regulator depending on how it's sold and which situation. And I'm hoping that we get more clarity in final regulation.
Since this is a developer-heavy conference, I'll make an analogy to voice over internet protocol, because when that came along, you didn't need to use the old copper wire networks to make phone calls anymore. You could do it from the command line interface if you wanted to, using voice over internet protocol. But most of you don't do that. Most of you actually have, one of these, and you pay a provider because of the security and the better user experience. And so the analogy here is that you're never going to get rid of these open source protocols. Once they're out in the wild, the genie's out of the bottle. They will never be uninvented, just like voice over internet protocol. But yet the lit markets are where most people in telco do their business. And yes, we know the government is surveilling our phone calls, and that the telecom companies will give information if law enforcement comes asking. Yet, if you really are that concerned about privacy, you can use Tor and you can use the command line interface to make your phone calls. So, long story short, I think the right approach for regulators is to do what the telecom regulators did when voice over internet protocol came along and say, okay, you don't have to stick with your copper wire networks. We're not forcing you to do that. We're letting you adopt the new technology. And most people from a user perspective had no idea that the back end got swapped out when that happened. But they're voluntarily using the centralized providers, which are interfacing with law enforcement. The escape valve, though, is that because these are open source protocols that will never be uninvented, you always, if you really are afraid, or if you are living in an Orwellian state, which hell, the US seems to be going in that direction, then you can transact on your own if you want to and you have the skill set. So I really would encourage the regulators to think of it that way. Create incentives for people to do business in the lit markets if you want to watch them. I am aware that the national security apparatus in the US is really starting to get uncomfortable with how much of this industry has been pushed offshore, because they're losing the ability to do the surveillance. And it's going to be fascinating, regardless of who wins the election, to see that sort of CBDC type, we want to surveil everybody on one end, versus the national security apparatus on the other. They actually are aligned in some ways, but the pro-CBDC crowd, which is the Warrenite crowd right now, is trying to kill all the private sector versions.
Enjoying the event? Fire up that wallet and delegate your ADA to Rare Stake Pool. For over 3 years, Rare has been committed to providing high-quality staking services. And we're now Chang Hard Fork ready. Thank you for your support.
And trying to push us offshore, and now we're seeing the national security apparatus push back, and we'll see who wins.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. And I think it kind of leads to my next question, Erin. I'll start with you on this one. Is there some concern, at least from your perspective, that we are driving a lot of business in the crypto space and blockchain space offshore? And are we at that point of no return, where maybe the damage has been too much for a lot of these companies to ever want to come back or want to build here?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that has been the case, and I have seen that happen personally with many projects that get funded here and do a lot of development here, and then when they're ready to launch, they go elsewhere because they can't make their way through the regulatory landscape as it is. I don't know that I would say it's too late. I do think that there is, when we have a regulatory framework that is clear, that is fit for purpose, that is built for the crypto space, and that has a pathway to actually compliance, right? I mean, part of the problem today has been not only is it unclear what the guidelines are, even if you're going to follow a path, there is no path to regulatory compliance, right? You have the SEC knocking on your door saying you're selling unregistered securities and you need to register. Right, exactly. And they say, okay, well, how do we register? That's great. They say, go talk to trading and markets. You go talk to trading and markets, and they say, we have absolutely no pathway for that to happen for you. So there's no pathway to compliance. I think that once that is resolved, I do think that it will become more clear on how to launch here. So I don't think it's too late, but it certainly is the landscape that we're in at the moment.
Same question to me. So this is where I think the U.S., and you mentioned this a little bit earlier, I think this is where the United States has to lead on this issue. This bleeds into other aspects of policy. It's kind of like you said, you have to have some laws in play to figure it out and to make sure you know what you're doing so it's not confusing. That address all types of issues with contracts and how does it work state to state? Is there a federal law? But again, I think bottom line is the U.S. has to lead on this issue, and we have to be at the forefront. Otherwise, somebody else is going to do it. And you kind of see this if you're not talking about digital currency in other aspects of currency. We're talking about the dollars that we use and some of the things that are going around the globe with other countries coming together, the bloc countries, for example. I think we have to lead on this issue. Otherwise, we're going to be left behind.
Erin and I were talking before we got on stage about the single most important thing that happened in this regulatory space this week is Chuck Schumer going out publicly and saying that he wants to get a bill passed before the end of this year. And that he did also publicly say, which I understand is true, that the Republicans were the ones that decided to block it happening before the election because they think they might get a better deal if the election comes out the way they're hoping that it will. We'll see. But Chuck Schumer, given that that Biden is a lame duck at this point and that it's kind of acknowledged he wasn't really in control of these issues anyway during his presidency, Chuck Schumer is probably the most powerful person in D.C. on these issues because he's majority leader in the Senate and he controls what gets to the floor of the U.S. Senate. And if he wants it to go to the floor of the U.S. Senate, it's going. So I think that's a huge positive. And who knows what's going to happen in this election, but my sense is that as an industry, we should take what we can get right now, as opposed to trying to wait and hope for a different outcome in the election. If the Democrats take the House, Maxine Waters is going to be House Financial Services Committee chair, and she's a Warrenite. She doesn't want any of this supported in the law at all. So the factions in the Democratic Party might be warring with each other, and regardless of who's president, again, I'm not sure that we're going to get a better outcome after the election, and I think that as an industry, the best outcome might be in a lame duck session.
Really, really appreciate each of your responses. As we kind of zoom out a little bit here, and I'm going to preface this by saying this is not legal or financial advice by any of my panelists up here, but when you look at some of these projects that are just getting started out and they're looking to build and maybe launch a token or do some different things, what are some things from a legal standpoint that they should be thinking about as they approach building and building out their projects? And I guess, Caitlin, we'll start with you and work our way down from there.
Try to find something that the SEC hasn't already targeted and use that as a roadmap. That's my best advice. But I must admit that's not my area. So over to you.
So one of my passions is diligence, and that is probably the least sexy thing to talk about at a crypto conference is diligence. But I really get on a soapbox when it comes to that, especially if you're starting out and you're building something new, and you're going out and you're finding the partners that you're going to work with, understanding who they are, what do they have best practices in place? Are they segregating assets? All of those great best practices. I think it's the single most important thing that you can do. Try to navigate the regulatory space as best you can, which typically just looks like keeping good records, having proper disclosures, understanding what that means in the current framework, and understanding how the landscape is shifting and constantly staying up to date on that.
So great answers. I sort of take this back for a second. So like when I interview clients, right? I do the client interview. It's so important because I want to know whether I'm going to like that client and want to work with them. So I base a lot of my clients on personality. And if I don't like their personality, I'm not going to work with them. But being a sole practitioner, I get to make that decision. I would put the impetus on each of you to do the same thing when you're talking to lawyers or people who are doing compliance. You want somebody that knows what they're doing and can have a broad landscape of sort of what's happening around the country and around the world and understand the sort of what's happening, because you don't want just a contracts lawyer would be great, somebody who knows privacy and copyright, all these other sort of aspects of the law, but you want somebody who's involved in it. And I don't mean this as a shameless plug, but a guy like Rick, for example, somebody who's involved in it, knows what's happening, is invested in it. So that, to me, I think, I would put the impetus on you guys to interview your lawyers or whoever your compliance folks are to figure out what they know and whether they can actually help you accomplish what you're trying to accomplish, or tell you no, that it can't be accomplished. Because the last thing you want is somebody telling you, yes, you can do this, and the next thing you know, the SEC is calling or seizing your assets.
If anyone is saying definitively about anything, yes, you can do this, that they
Right.
probably
There is
probably
no
bad
such thing
advice.
as a yes. It's in the banking world they call it a SNO, supervisory non-objection. It's not a
Exactly.
yes.
It's not a yes, but it's not a no.
Well, really appreciate your responses. One question I have for you, Caitlin, when we talk about, Custodia Bank a little bit in terms of like the regulatory challenge that you guys have had to navigate, and you guys have certainly kind of like led the way for examples for other businesses that want to kind of follow your guys' path. What are some of these challenges that you're facing, and really kind of speak to the industry as a whole from that perspective?
Well, we haven't talked about the debanking challenge. I think for the developers here, a lot of you are probably more worried about the SEC, but in a lot of cases, you're also worried about your startup being debanked. I mean, everybody in this space has experienced it, ourselves included. And I mean, frankly, I think Charles has said this publicly. He's had it happen to him too. I mean, he's a billionaire and legit businesses, and he gets debanked just for being in this space. And so we're trying to solve that problem. And we haven't talked much about Wyoming. You were mentioning the state importance of the roles of state governments in this space, Jeremy, and I think that's right. Wyoming is really staking out a claim, pun intended. And there is a conference next week. Charles is going to be there for the Wyoming Blockchain Symposiums, co-sponsored by the University of Wyoming and SALT, which is Anthony Scaramucci's group. And he deliberately picked that time because it's in Jackson Hole right before the Fed. And it's now come out that the Fed was prohibited from attending by internal policy at the Fed. So unfortunately, it's too bad, because that would have been a place where they could have at least learned something, as opposed to continuing to stick their head in the sand and try to pretend that this is all going to go away. But I just saw before I got on stage, Dennis Porter just tweeted out that all this debanking has to stop. We're seeing it at Custodia, because when other banks close bank accounts, everyone knows we're the bank that will bank the industry and will fight to bank the industry. And they come and sometimes they urgently need to open accounts with us. And I want to thank everyone in the industry who is doing business with us and trying to make sure that we do thrive, because man, we don't know what's going to come on the other side of this. It is possible that this is an insurmountable obstacle and that it's not possible to solve the debanking problem. It is, I like the way Tyler Winklevoss put it, it is insidious. The bank regulators will go and say, hey, you got a nice bank there. And they don't tell the banks they can't bank the industry, but they say it's risky, and then all of a sudden we're going to throw more examinations at you and just drive up your regulatory costs. And gee, it would be too bad if you lost your account, and like Peter Schiff's bank did in Puerto Rico. So, and a lot of Puerto Rico banks that were serving the industry suddenly got their accounts yanked. So we got to deal with this. It's Orwellian, unfortunately, and it has to be I think, either or both, a congressional mandate to stop targeting law-abiding businesses that the regulators don't like politically, or a change and a cleaning house of the regulators.
Yeah, and Rick, to your earlier question around, groups leaving the U.S. and, and is it too late? I actually think that the banking question is probably should be top of mind when you're thinking about where you're going to launch. Can you find a banking partner, and will you be able to keep that banking partner?
Jeremy, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think a lot of these issues are connected, and I love what's been said. When you're looking at like AI and blockchain and cryptocurrencies, to me, I feel like a lot of folks, particularly in the legislature, in both the state level and the federal level, like Caitlin said, kind of putting their head in the sand. And there needs to be, and even in the legal field, we see this. So we started the task force on artificial intelligence for California Lawyers Association. And even in that context, it's very difficult to get lawyers to adopt the technology, right? Because there's a certain way of doing things. So I just say that, again, we need to get legislators to do their job. And we need to have, there used to be this sort of aspect in the country where you had a law and it was applied equally, right? And now you see these banks being shut down, and it's like, we can't do that. It can't be politically based. So, great point.
Yeah, I think each of you raised some really good points, and I think from the perspective of somebody who's worked with a lot of clients in this space, I think a lot of them do feel targeted, and it's
Totally.
yeah. And I think where we're going to start running into more issues is the further and further you push away this industry. I don't know if they'd want to come back. I mean, we see companies like A16Z that have left. And I say this as a U.S.-based attorney. I want these businesses here. I want them built here. But when I talked, to some clients and they're telling me about all these great different things they want to do, they want to launch a token, I have to say, hey guys, you probably can't do that here, right? And it pains me. So I'm hopeful that, obviously discussions like this and engaging with legislators both at the federal and state levels will help drive, these discussions forward. I'm a big proponent also of education as well. I think our legislators and those in government and regulatory agencies do need to be educated. And I think the conundrum here is that actually a lot of them actually are educated and do understand the technology more than we're led to believe, but I still think they obviously have certain agendas regardless of that knowledge. So it's going to be interesting to see kind of what happens next, but we are out of time. So I want to thank all of my fellow panelists for taking the time, and thank you guys so much for listening.
Rare Evo 2025 tickets are on sale now. Save big. General admission passes are discounted to $250, and VIP passes are only $800. Join us August 7th through 9th, 2025 at Caesars Palace, Las Vegas. Hurry, only 30 days left to save. Visit rareevo.io and buy your tickets now.